On today's show, we'll talk about some buy low and sell high candidates in terms of prospects all over the NHL, and we'll give you an early look at some top 2025 NHL draft eligibles, all coming up on today's show on Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Hadi Kalakash, joined by Sebastian High, and on today's show, we'll start off by giving you a buy low and sell high breakdown of some NHL prospects all over the NHL, whether that's, in the junior systems in Canada and the USA, wherever you find them, we've got them. So we'll talk about some buy low candidates first. Noel Gunler, Oscar Olofsson, Vinzenz Rohrer, and a lot more. Let's talk about some sell high candidates whose value we think is at an all-time high right now, including guys like Jack Devine, Tristan Luneau, Conor Geekie, and a lot more. So make sure to stick around until the end as well, where we'll discuss some 2025 NHL draft eligibles that are really tearing it up right now. We've got a main top three here, including James Hagens from the NTDP. We'll talk about all that coming up. But before we get into any of that, today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. So let's get this started here with some buy low candidates. You wrote a couple of these names down. I just want your thoughts on these first and foremost. We'll talk about Noel Gunler first, who I think, first didn't get a lot of love in his draft year and slipped a bit. A really good goal scorer, player who can really rifle the puck. But yeah, what makes you think his value's at an all-time low right now?
He hasn't been producing very much. I've watched him a little bit in the last year and a half, and
Yeah.
there's definitely still warts in his game. Like this is a flawed player, and he's a buy low for a reason here, more so than other players that we're going to talk about in this segment. But I think that when a player has a tool the level of Gunler's goal scoring, whether that be his shot or his off puck movement to find soft ice in the offensive zone, I'm personally always willing to take a big swing on that. He had 18 points in 31 AHL games last year, but is loaned back to Liga this season and is, again, half a point a game there. So small sample this season in Liga, but the production hasn't popped off just yet. But maybe if he gets traded and gets reassigned or gets new instructions and a new development staff, something could shift there. But I've always really liked the goal scoring element. The offensive skill is quite impressive. The off puck engagement is rough. It's still not great, but I think that the tools here are overall pretty impressive. And I mean, look, Carolina has already so many great pieces in their prospect pool. They draft so incredibly well. They're going to be pretty backed up in terms of handing out contracts pretty soon. So Gunler is not a player that I think they desperately need to keep. And I do think that teams with the worst prospect pools than Carolina's could use a player with the upside and goal scoring that Noel Gunler has.
Yeah, and realistically, I mean, what do you think the value is there in terms of how you could acquire him? Right,
pretty low. It'll probably be like a 4th or 5th round draft pick, or maybe a depth NHL or like a 7th defenseman or something along those lines. It wouldn't be a very big trade by any means. Yes, sure, he was drafted 41st overall in 2020, but it's been 3 rough years with little development since then in terms of really addressing the weaknesses in his game. He's very much still the same style of player that he was before, but I do think that there's enough here to potentially project as a bottom 6 goal scorer, probably on a third line with less defensive, brain fart, with less defensive responsibilities than you get on a 4th line traditionally. But it would be a small trade, but I do think there's enough value here to be worth a little swing for the fences by a team with a worse prospect pool.
Yeah, absolutely. That brings us to Vinzenz Rohrer, a 3rd round pick of the Montreal Canadiens a couple of drafts ago. A prospect who in his draft plus one, really impressed with the Ottawa 67s. He's bagged himself a move to Austria to continue his development, and
Switzerland.
Switzerland rather. Yes, I get those mixed up a lot. But yeah, Switzerland. I mean, he's been struggling to produce so far in the pro league, which didn't really come as a surprise to me. I think his game is still, he plays with a lot of intensity. He's got good defensive engagement. He's got a good motor, but in terms of his ability to play under physical pressure, that's always been a bit of a point of contention. So do you think that plays a major part in the fact that he has been producing so far? Is just the shift in environment and also the shift in competition level and physicality?
He's also playing like 12 minutes a night, so it's not really an environment conducive to high-end production for him right now. But I've watched like 2 or 3 games of his this season so far, and there've definitely been sequences where I've kind of seen him struggle a little bit. Like this is a very young player. He just turned 19 a couple months ago, and he's
Yeah,
playing professional competition. And like the reason that I think he deserves a spot in this list here is far less about his own production and far more about the Montreal Canadiens and the fact that they are going to have to unload some prospects because they have very few contract slots open. It's a
yeah.
far bigger issue than with Carolina, for instance. But yeah,
Mhm.
I think that Rohrer is a player that you could understand if if the Habs wanted to maybe flip right now before his value could tank from lower production or whatever it may be. And I think like the Montreal Canadiens could really use some reinforcements, whether that be like at right defense, for instance, or
Yeah.
just in terms of some depth goal scoring. But I think Rohrer could be a piece that the Habs move in a bigger deal. I'd be more surprised if it were a 1-for-1 trade of like Rohrer for a pick or something. I think like this is a 19-year-old prospect who had a very good D+1.
Yeah.
Would make less sense in that situation, but in terms of a larger deal to acquire a piece that the Habs need right away, Rohrer is one
Mhm.
of the players that comes to mind as a decent bargaining chip in there.
Yeah, absolutely, and sort of a bigger name here. One of the first, not the first goaltender drafted a couple drafts ago, in Sebastian Cossa, who's been struggling in Grand Rapids so far. But still, I mean, he's getting decent minutes. He's getting a decent amount of starts, which is what you want to see from a goaltender uh, prospect playing the AHL. But yeah, do you think that he could be? Is he the type of prospect who could be a part of a bigger deal, especially for a Detroit Red Wings team that's starting to produce right now? They're starting to play really well, and could end up adding a big piece in a trade with Sebastian Cosin. What do you think a reasonable return would be for a team in that situation that has this prospect that hasn't been producing that well and that wants to add a kind of bigger piece that'll kind of solidify their spot as that'll solidify their turn of the page from a rebuild?
I think that Costas a great bargaining chip here. Like, yes, his value is lower than when he was drafted, but like looking at it from Detroit's perspective, they already have Trey Augustine as well as a reinforcement in goal for the future, and he's been playing some really good hockey at the NCAA level so far this season. And Casa, I mean, he's played 7 AHL games this season. He's under 900 save percentage, just under. He's at 898 right now. But last season he really struggled at the A, but did all right in the ECHL. But he's turning 21 in the next week, and the clock is kind of ticking there. And of course, goaltenders take way longer to develop, and this is far from a prospect with little value. But I think that Detroit is in a unique position here where Casa is expendable in terms of the goaltending future, and they have a need of acquiring more talent to make a bigger push because the Atlantic Division is just it's an absolute killer this year. So I think he'd be a decent bargaining
Yeah,
chip there. But what's your perspective on Casa and a potential trade?
I think it's decent value. I'd say right now, as you mentioned, 2 years of struggles in the AHL, the upside is becoming questionable, that kind of thing. I think it might be time to kind of give him fresher air, and you can also get a decent enough return in a trade, especially if it's part of a bigger deal. But yeah, to end things off, we'll talk about Oscar Oloson a bit, who's a former first round pick of the Colorado Avalanche. Yeah, and he's playing with the Eagles right now in the AHL. He had 20 points in 63 games last year with one NHL game played. Really not much to talk about there. This year, a bit of the same, but an uptick in production, a slight uptick in production. He's got 7 points in 16 games. Been leaning into the offensive side a bit more, but there's still some questions about his ability to produce at the next level. He's on pace for barely above 30 points this season with the Eagles in the AHL. So I think you can get some decent enough value there. If you trade for him and allow him to kind of develop his overall game a bit more and kind of uplift his overall skill set, because the skill set's not necessarily NHL level yet, but he's leaning into his offensive side a bit more, and you want to see a bit more of that. So I think if you trade for him right now, get him in your system, play him in your top six, and give him those high end minutes, surrounded by players who can kind of offset the defensive game a tiny bit, I think we've got a decent chance at getting an NHLer out of him. And if you can get that for scraps, absolutely pull the trigger on that. I think that's definitely worth it. But that wraps things up for our first segment. We'll head into our second segment and talk about some sell high candidates and prospects who we think are at an all-time high in terms of value right now. We'll get into that after these messages from our sponsors over at BetterHelp here at Locked On NHL Prospects. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a great product that allows you to get assistance with your mental health in times of struggle, especially right now with the weather changing, with it getting darker, less sun throughout the day. BetterHelp can allow you to follow up with a therapist regularly online without having to go to meetings in person if that's inconvenient. It's a very convenient product that allows you to also change therapists if you're not satisfied with the one that's following you right now. I've personally struggled with mental health overall, especially throughout the last couple of years, and I've really benefited from therapy. It's allowed me to kind of put my experience into perspective, to add some tools to my toolkit that allow me to go through my day with a bit more productivity, patience, kindness, and overall, the broader benefits of therapy are really clear. I mean, a lot of people will talk to you about their personal experience in therapy in a positive way. It's very rare that you'll talk to people about it negatively. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. And again, you can switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. So find your bright spot this season with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNHL today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNHL. Check it out. Alrighty, so moving on to our second segment, we'll talk about some sell-high candidates. I think this is definitely worth a look because a lot of teams are looking to retain some contract slots, and you can't necessarily offer one to every player, and especially you want to maximize your value on these prospects because at the last count, about 30% of mid to late first round picks make the NHL in a sustainable and regular way in terms of playing above 100 NHL games. So it's an interesting subject, I think, for sure. And there's a lot of names that we can go through that we both think, I think, have an all-time high value right now. I think we can start with Jack Devine, who's absolutely tearing it up right now in the NCAA, right?
Oh, he really is. I mean, the production this season has been incredible. The progression year to year there with the University of Denver has been really impressive, and he's really blossomed into that organization's top offensive talent. And it's always a bit iffy to yell that you gotta sell high on this player that's just breaking out right now. But with Devine specifically, I think that the toolkit itself is really more conducive to a bottom six projection than anything inside the top six. And right now, I think in terms of value as a prospect, he might be valued a little bit higher than the average bottom six projection prospect would, and that kind of makes him a decent candidate in this sell high slot.
Absolutely, yeah. And he's at 18 points in 12 games, including 10 goals. Like, teams are going to get a look at that, and I think it's definitely worth a look to kind of give him to kind of look into his value as the Florida Panthers and see, okay, how much do we value this prospect and how much can we get out of him? And I think that at this stage, if you're going to get something out of him, it's right now. The value is decently high, and it's just about how much you value a bottom six prospect who you drafted, because that obviously plays into consideration, right? I mean, you drafted this player, you've invested in their development, you want to see them out. But at the same time, you look at the production versus the upside, and there's a mismatch there. And I think the Florida Panthers can definitely maximize that profit there. But moving on to another couple of names here that I find very interesting. First and foremost, Tristan Luneau of the Anaheim Ducks, who had a stint with the NHL team this year. I think he's sticking around for a bit. And yeah, I just, with the amount of defensemen that the Anaheim Ducks have, it's just how high can he play in the lineup realistically, right?
Yeah, and I mean, he got 2 NHL games to start the season, but it was quickly sent down to the A afterwards, and he's played now 6 games in the AHL since then, and has
Mhm.
collected 2 assists in that span.
Yeah,
With Luneau, there is that history of high-end skill. This was a first overall pick in the QMJHL draft, and
yeah,
the mobility, the intelligence, the calculated dissection of defensive structures in the offensive zone, which has really progressed very nicely year upon year in my viewings.
yeah,
That's all great, and I think that Luneau definitely has a chance to be a decent number 4, maybe number 3 defenseman moving forward, like within the next like 2 years potentially. But Anaheim is an organization that has a lot of depth on the blue line, and Luneau could definitely play a part in that. I think I personally would still kind of stick with Noah Warren. If I were Anaheim, I've always been a bigger fan of Warren's game. I don't think he projects quite as high up in the lineup as Luneau does right now, but I think
yeah.
that he will be a very consistent, calming number 5 presence. And if Anaheim is deciding between those 2 right shot defensemen, I think that you can get a lot more back for Luneau than you could with Warren, and I think that the difference between the 2 is marginal at best. So I think that there's definitely reason to at
Yeah,
least
absolutely. I mean,
consider the options here, right? Like there's going to
yeah,
be like there's always like a market for mobile right shot defensemen with pedigree going back multiple years.
yeah.
But yeah, like Anaheim could easily hold on to him as well and just kind of see how things shake up there in the blue line. But if they're looking to maximize value and make sure they don't have a massive logjam there moving forward, it could make sense to move on.
For sure. And on that note, I mean, Maverick Lamoureux, I think, is a decent candidate here in terms of sell high value. He's producing really well in the QMJHL right now. As a 6'7" defenseman with a lot of range, with defensive value, with a physical presence. I don't see the pathway to a top 4 in the NHL for Lamoureux. And if that's the case, if the most you'll be getting out of him is a bottom pair defenseman, and you can get, I don't know, a second round pick, a first round pick, or have him be a part of a bigger trade where he's a main piece that allows you to get a really good either defenseman or forward that's going to bolster your Arizona Coyotes team that's currently outplaying itself right now. I mean, it's they're producing really well, and that's aided
Yeah.
by Logan Cooley. If you want to find a long term partner for Logan Cooley on offense, I think Maverick Lamoureux is a great chip in the trade to allow you to get that piece. So yeah, I think that's interesting as well.
And another
Another,
chipper in that type of trade could be Conor Geekie. I mean,
yeah,
Arizona has a lot of potential trade chips here, and again, Geekie was from that same 2022 draft class as Lamoureux, and he's producing very well right now with the Wenatchee Wild. I almost said the Winnipeg Ice
yeah,
with the Wenatchee Wild, and that's been on a team that's been without Zach Benson and without Matthew Savoy for most of the season. So
mhm,
the production's been very impressive there. I think the progression from last season has been impressive too. Like he's kind of taking the reins of that team this year, and uh, definitely an interesting prospect. But at least in terms of long term projection, I personally don't see any upside here beyond second line, and I think he has the trade value, especially if you combine him with a guy like Maverick Lamoureux, where you can get a lot more out of that, right?
yeah. You can get a top end, like high end first line player with Lamoureux and Geeky as part of your core of that trade with a pick with a roster player. You can get a really good player. I'm talking like Panarin levels of good. I mean, there's a lot of value you can get out of these two in a trade. But lastly, I just want to talk about Luke Tuck real quick, who's at a point per game right now with Boston University, and a lot of that's due to Macklin celebration. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, he's
And
just,
Hudson.
and Lane Hudson, of course, but just playing on the same line as Celebrini, spending every minute on the ice with a player as dynamic, as fluid, and as intelligent as Celebrini is, can really bolster your game. And I think that Luke Tuck is probably going to struggle to put up points at the NHL level. And if he does make the NHL, we're talking probably bottom 6, maybe even fourth line upside, which
Yeah.
if you can get anything for that, as he stands right now, I think it's time to pull the trigger, especially with, again, Montreal not having that many roster spots.
Yeah.
It might be time to kind of make that move. But yeah, that wraps things up for our second segment about some sell high candidates. Now we'll talk about some 2025 NHL draft eligible stars, including James Hagen, Michael Misa, a lot more coming up. All that's coming up after a quick word from our sponsors over at Game Time. If you're looking for tickets and don't have a lot of time to figure things out, Game Time is the best place to get that figured out. Game Time is really useful for me because my schedule is really volatile. So I can find myself with an afternoon free out of nowhere, and Game Time is the best place to get last minute tickets. They have tickets that sell up to the last minute before the event, and sometimes even an hour after it starts, you can still get tickets for that event, whether that's sports, theater, comedy, anything you need tickets for. Game Time has you covered. They've got a bunch of deals that help you save money as well, including zone deals where you pick the section and Game Time picks the seats. That gives you about an average of 18% of savings. It's really easy to find and buy tickets for every kind of event in your area through Game Time. They make it really easy and simple. Their Game Time guarantee makes sure that if you find a ticket for the same in the same section and row for less than what Game Time has to offer, Game Time will reimburse you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL at checkout for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply, but again, really simple. Just create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Alrighty, so closing things off here in our third segment, we'll talk about some 2025 NHL draft eligibles. It seems like a very exciting draft to start things off. I mean, it's early in the process, but my goodness. Let's start with probably our first overall pick. James Hagens is absolutely ridiculous. This kid was the best player at the U18s as a 16-year-old. Outplaying Will Smith, outplaying Ryan Leonard, outplaying all these guys that went really high in last year's draft.
Cole Eiserman.
Cole Eiserman as well, way better than him both at that tournament and so far this year in the NTDP. James Hagens is the runaway best player on the NTDP. I don't think it's even fairly close.
No.
Yeah, he's 5'10", 168, but again, he's very, very young, and is still kind of developing. But yeah, he has 30 points in 16 games so far with the NTDP, 13-7 against USHL competition. At this past Five Nations tournament for Team USA, he had 11 points in 4 games, including 7 assists in the semifinal and finals combined. So yeah,
is that good?
Maybe, perhaps, somehow. But yeah,
Somehow.
James Hagens, premier playmaker, just an absurd, like the vision, the dynamism, the playmaking ability, that combination, I think it far exceeds Logan Cooley's in this draft year for sure, right?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean,
Yeah.
I've watched a decent amount of Hagens in passing. I haven't dialed in viewings of like shift by shift going over every single decision he makes, but in terms of D-1, yes, I think he trumps Logan Cooley. And in terms of draft year, I think we'll see as this year continues and as next draft starts. But he is an exceptional talent. I think that, as you said, it's not very close in the NTDP this year. Like, he is quite a ways ahead of Cole Eiserman. And this is a player who, at the very least right now, just absolutely screams first overall talent. The intelligence, the skill, the maturity of many of the off-puck habits, especially offensively. It's all there. It's all really refined. It's all really impressive. The upside's insane. The floor is very high. Everything is very impressive there with James Hagens, and he is a tremendously fun player to watch. And pretty much every single time I tune into the NTDP play, there's at least a handful of plays where I'm just left my jaw kind of hanging open, being like, that kid's 16. That's insane. And he's been really impressive. But he's not the only high end talent in that 2025 top end of the draft either.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's crazy how we're talking about an exceptional status player as a second overall pick here, and an exceptional status player who is producing really well in the OHL so far, and Michael Misa. Misa is, I feel, a bit more flashy, a bit more daring on the puck than
Yeah.
James Hagens. I'd say the word to encapsulate Hagens is dynamic and creative. Whereas with Misa, it's flashy in terms of he's trying things every shift. He's trying to push pucks to the middle, to cut across opponents' hands to get to the middle of the ice, to shoot pucks in, under sticks and between legs, and he's exploring his game in ways that I feel like James Higgins is a bit more of my stick to my guns type of player who knows exactly what he's good at and does that. But yeah, Misa's really, really fun. I don't think he can really compete with James Hagen's level of maturity and overall dynamism. But yeah, what's your thoughts on Misa so far? I feel like you've watched him a tiny bit more than I have so far.
Yeah, I mean, watching Saginaw is always a blast. I mean, they have a ton of fun players, and
Yeah.
Misa's been excellent. Like, this is a player who I you don't really see many OHLers play with the confidence that he already had last year as a 15-year-old in that league,
Yeah.
and that has only progressed since then. This is a player that, as you said, he tries everything. He pushes the limits of his toolkit. He is very, very creative. Yes, there's plenty of mistakes, but that's what you kind of want to see, especially in a 16-year-old player. Like, he's still 16,
Yeah.
and he is well over a point a game in the OHL this season. He is pretty much the best player on the ice for Saginaw, apart from Zane Parekh on most shifts. And even then, it's
Yeah.
kind of a toss-up between him and Parekh. Like, those are the two standouts in Saginaw. But yeah,
Mhm.
Michael Misa is a special talent as well. And as you said, I think the fact that we are already as sold on James Higgins as a first overall talent is especially notable considering just how good Michael Misa is.
Yeah, absolutely. That brings me to a player who I don't see mentioned as much, but really made a splash at the U18s in Porter Martone. Martone right now, I mean, he's ridiculously good as a goal scorer. As a 17-year-old, as a 16, 17-year-old playing in a draft -1, he's already like tied for the top 10 in goals in the
Yeah.
OHL right now. He's got 13 goals in 19 games for 22 points, above a point per game in his draft -1 with the Mississauga Steelheads, and more often than not, taking that team by storm. I mean, he's taking over shifts at times. The issue with Martoni is he's still very inconsistent. There are some games where he just falls off the map, but when he's on, he's on. I mean, he's got 2 hat tricks this year. He's been playing really good hockey when he's on. And yeah, I mean, we're talking about a player who can absolutely rifle the puck off balance, square to the puck, on his back leg, on his front leg, um, one timer, wrist or backhand. I mean, just name it. He can shoot it. His goal scoring ability is ridiculous, and on top of that, he's got enough vision and maturity and physical ability and motor to kind of round out the rest of his skill set and uplift his goal scoring ability, which is what you want to see. I mean, we talk often about the toolkit. Martoni has the toolkit. It's not just tools in isolation. It's everything working together to uplift his game. And that's the main difference between a player like Martoni and a player like Alexander Holtz or Noel Gunler. Players who have a really good shot in isolation, but the rest of the game actually hinders their tool rather than uplifts it. So yeah, I'm really excited to see what happens here with Martoni because he seems like a really good prospect in the making. But that wraps things up for today's show. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They're a 24/7 news channel about sports that's run by the Locked On Podcast Network. You can find it on YouTube or wherever you find your podcasts. And make sure to tune in next week as we continue our prospects coverage. This has been Hattie Kalakesh with Sebastian High. We hope you tune in next time.